When I saw his name pop up on the screen, I felt a strange tightness in my chest, not fear exactly, but something colder, deeper. My husband stood across the room, just out of reach, and the phone was still in my hand. But for a moment, I saw it all playing out, the scene I had imagined so many times. What if he walked over? What if he asked, "Who is that?" And what if I had to answer, not with lies, not with deflection, but with the truth? Because this wasn't just a text. It was him. And not a stranger, not someone I could pretend was just a name. No. This was someone we both knew. Someone who never should have sent that message. I felt my fingertips go numb. My husband turned toward me and smiled, an ordinary smile, oblivious. But my body betrayed me. I flinched. He raised an eyebrow. "Everything okay?" he asked. And I said yes. Of course I said yes. I said it too fast. He walked away, and I stood there, my phone still glowing in my palm, the message unopened. I didn't need to open it. I knew what it would say. And it terrified me. Because 3 months ago, I made a mistake. A single moment that never should have happened, never even should have started. And now, I can feel everything beginning to crack. But before I tell you what the message said, before I explain how I let myself drift into a place I never imagined, let me tell you how it all started. Let me tell you what led to that moment, the one that changed everything. There's something disorienting about living a life that looks perfect from the outside. You wake up beside someone who says good morning, you make coffee, you go to work, you smile when you're supposed to, and if you're not careful, you start to believe that's all there is. That the absence of crisis equals happiness. That routine means stability. That predictability is peace. I believed that for a long time. I'm 53. I've been married for 27 of those years. I work as a nurse in a city clinic, and I've always taken pride in being the calm one, the dependable one. At work, at home. Even in the mirror. My face has lines I didn't notice appearing. My hands are strong, capable, used to pressure and pain. My life is, or was, simple. Until it wasn't. It started with a favor. My husband's friend from university, they'd stayed close over the years, had a son, mid-20s, studying film. Bright, charming, always polite. I'd seen him at a few barbecues, holiday dinners. A little too sure of himself, maybe, but sweet in that eager, puppyish way some young men have when they're still being treated like children by their parents and want to prove otherwise. One evening, after dinner, my husband casually mentioned that the boy, I'll just call him he for now, was working on a short film project and needed help with a promotional shoot in one of those escape rooms downtown. He just needs a second person, my husband said, already scrolling through his calendar. And I can't make it. You'd be perfect, though. It was meant to be nothing. A background task. A quick outing. I said yes because saying yes was my default setting. I didn't think twice. The escape room was in an old building, dimly lit, with a velvet curtain and creaky floors. I arrived early. He was already there, setting up lights and camera angles, chatting with the staff like he owned the place. When he saw me, his face lit up. "You actually came," he said, sounding almost surprised. He handed me a prop, a small leather-bound notebook. "Just follow the clues," he said, "and at some point, pretend to trust me." It was part of the game. He was filming a story about connection under pressure, he explained. Two people trapped in a room, forced to rely on each other. "There's a scene near the end," he added. "It's written a little, dramatically. But don't worry. We can skip it." I should have asked what scene. I should have read the script. But I didn't. We were ushered into the first room. The door closed behind us. And everything changed. The room was dim, lit only by wall sconces. A timer clicked overhead. We followed riddles, moved objects, deciphered codes. It was all silly, performative, juvenile, and yet oddly intimate. I was laughing. I remember that clearly. At one point, he adjusted my collar, and I brushed it off as part of the scene. At another, I had to crawl through a small tunnel, and he offered his hand without hesitation. I took it. In the final room, there was a chair and a script. A note instructed us, confess something. Trust must be mutual. I hesitated. Want to skip this part? I asked. He shook his head. It's just a game, he said. And I believed him. I sat down. He sat opposite me. The camera blinked in the corner, small, red, barely visible. I read my lines. Something about fear, about letting go. And then, suddenly, he leaned forward. His voice was low, almost gentle. You're easy to trust, he said. You make people feel safe. And then we kissed. That's all I'll say. That's all that happened. That's all that should have happened. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't passionate. It was a moment, out of time, out of place, and as soon as it ended, we both pulled back. He blinked. I blinked. No words. The game ended. The door opened. The lights came on. And we walked out. I remember the wind outside feeling sharper than usual. I remember my hands trembling as I reached for my coat. He thanked me, hugged me briefly, and said he'd send me the footage just in case I wanted a copy. I said thank you. I didn't mean it. At home, I didn't say anything. Not to my husband. Not to anyone. I convinced myself it meant nothing, that it was just a game. But I didn't sleep well that night. Or the next. And when the envelope with the flash drive appeared on the hallway table 2 days later, my stomach dropped. It had no note. Just my name, written in quick, looping handwriting. I told myself I wouldn't look. I even put it in the drawer beneath my winter scarves. But at 2 a.m., I got up. I went downstairs. I plugged it in. The file was labeled simply, scene3_final.mp4. My hand hovered over the trackpad. My heart beat faster than I thought it could. I pressed play. And there I was. Sitting. Laughing. Leaning forward. Listening. Trusting. And then, we kissed. I shut the laptop before the scene even ended. I sat there in the dark, my fingers over my lips. I didn't know what scared me more, the fact that it happened, or the fact that I looked happy. Not confused. Not passive. Happy. And that, I think, was the real beginning. The next morning started as all others had: coffee, toast, a glance at the news, but everything felt slightly out of place, as if someone had nudged the world a few degrees off-center while I slept. My husband hummed softly as he got dressed for work, his voice drifting down the hallway, blending with the clinking of dishes and the soft purr of the kettle. Everything was normal. And that made it worse. I sat at the kitchen table staring at my phone, my thumb hovering over the message icon. I hadn't heard from him since the day of the shoot. No texts, no emails. The flash drive had been delivered anonymously, which only added to the unease. I kept wondering, had he watched it? Did he save it? Was he waiting for something? Or had he already forgotten it, moved on, left me with a memory I couldn't shake? The thought made my stomach turn. I got up, poured myself another cup of coffee I didn't want, and tried to distract myself with laundry, dishes, checking appointments for the week. But my thoughts circled like water circling a slow drain. I knew I should delete the file. I should throw away the flash drive and pretend it never existed. But I didn't. I couldn't. At work, I was more efficient than usual. I needed the distraction. I charted patient notes, reviewed prescriptions, handled calls. Colleagues noticed, made jokes, "Look who's on fire today," and I smiled back, pretending to be flattered. But underneath, my thoughts kept slipping back to that dark room, that final scene, that kiss. We kissed. The words played on a loop in my head, echoing with strange weight. It wasn't just the act itself. It was how unforced it felt. Natural. As if it had always been waiting, somewhere beneath the surface, unacknowledged but inevitable. And yet, I was married. I was loved. My husband wasn't cruel or inattentive. He didn't cheat, didn't raise his voice, didn't forget birthdays or anniversaries. He was good, steady, kind, gentle. But something had shifted between us over the years. We had stopped seeing each other. We moved through our lives side by side, rarely looking directly at one another. When had that begun? When had I become invisible? Later that afternoon, just as I was about to leave the clinic, my phone vibrated. I glanced at the screen. "You were amazing on camera. Just thought you should know." No name. No signature. Just that sentence. My heart jumped, and I felt an odd mix of dread and something else, something harder to admit. I wanted to reply. I didn't. I slipped the phone into my bag and left quickly, feeling the silence around me grow heavier. That evening, during dinner, I tried to focus on the conversation. My husband was talking about a project at work, something about contractors and delays, but I wasn't really listening. I watched his face, tried to read every wrinkle, every glance. I wondered what he would say if he knew. Would he be angry? Would he blame me? Would he even believe it wasn't premeditated? "Are you all right?" he asked suddenly. I blinked. "Yes, of course. Just tired." He nodded, took another bite. We didn't speak for the rest of the meal. After the dishes were done, I told him I was going for a walk. He didn't question it. I put on a coat, stepped outside, and let the cold air fill my lungs. The sky was dark, stars faint through the haze. I walked without direction, past houses with glowing windows, past fences and empty sidewalks. I wanted to scream, or cry, or confess, but instead, I walked. And then I saw him. He was leaning against the low brick wall near the park entrance, phone in hand, as if he'd been waiting. Or maybe it was coincidence. I didn't ask. "Hey," he said, standing straighter. I stopped a few feet away, unsure what I was doing. "I didn't expect to see you here," I said quietly. He shrugged. "I come here to think." We stood in silence. The air between us hummed with something unsaid. Finally, I broke it. "You shouldn't have sent that message." "I know," he replied. "But I meant it." I looked at him, then really looked, and he wasn't the boy I remembered from barbecues and birthdays. He was taller now, older in posture if not in age. Still too young, still reckless, but with a kind of confidence that made it easy to forget his inexperience. "That kiss," I said, forcing the words out, "was a mistake." He didn't argue. He didn't apologize. He just watched me. "I know," he said again. "But it still happened." And there it was. The truth. Not dressed up, not softened. Just laid out between us like a thread, one I could pick up or leave behind. "I'm married," I whispered. "I know. I have a life. I'm not trying to take it from you." I exhaled, shaky, unsure what I even wanted from this conversation. Maybe closure. Maybe understanding. Maybe to feel less alone. He stepped closer, not enough to touch, just enough for me to feel his presence. You deserve to be seen, he said. I swallowed hard. My throat ached. I see you, he added. I turned and walked away. Back at home, I took a long shower, scrubbing my skin until it turned red. I stared at my reflection in the fogged mirror. I looked the same eyes, same hair, same tired mouth. But I felt like a stranger. That night, lying in bed beside my husband, I stayed awake long after he drifted off. His breathing was steady, familiar. I listened to it like a lullaby from another lifetime. And I thought about how it began. A simple yes. A moment of play. A single kiss. We kissed. And now, nothing felt the same. The next few days passed with a strange stillness, like the hush before a storm. I moved through them carefully, quietly, making sure not to disturb anything that might unravel the fragile structure I had built to contain myself. I woke up beside my husband, made his coffee, pressed his shirts. At work, I listened to patients, offered comfort, gave injections. I smiled at the right moments. Nodded at the right times. But under the surface, I was treading water, always on the edge of slipping under. I didn't reply to the message. I read it over and over, sometimes in the silence of the early morning, sometimes while standing alone in the bathroom, holding the phone with trembling fingers. I knew the longer I left it unanswered, the harder it would become to pretend it hadn't been sent. And yet, answering it meant something I wasn't ready to admit. Even to myself. One night, while cleaning out a drawer in the kitchen, I found the flash drive again. I had tucked it between old batteries and expired coupons, as if it were just another forgotten object. But the weight of it in my hand reminded me that I hadn't forgotten. Not really. I considered destroying it. Snapping it in half. Dropping it down a storm drain. But I didn't. Instead, I put it back. Not because I wanted to keep it, but because I didn't know how to let it go. The following weekend, we hosted a small dinner for family friends. My husband was in good spirits, grilling in the backyard while I set the table, arranged cutlery, placed candles. Guests arrived, laughter filled the house, and for a while, I allowed myself to believe in the normalcy of it all. And then he walked in. He came with his father, of course. Smiling, charming, polite. He greeted me the way he always had, nothing in his expression to betray what lay beneath. No secret glances. No tension. But I felt the shift in the air, subtle as a change in pressure. I tried to ignore it, tried to act naturally. I poured wine. I passed plates. I laughed at stories. But every time he was near, I felt heat rise under my skin. And when our hands brushed, just once, reaching for the same bowl, I felt the jolt of memory surge through me like electricity. We both pulled back at the same time, and no one noticed. Except me. I noticed everything. After dinner, people mingled in the living room. I escaped to the kitchen, pretending to clear dishes. I needed air. I needed space. And then I heard footsteps behind me. You always do too much, he said softly. I didn't turn around. I focused on a stubborn spot on a plate that didn't exist. You should enjoy your own party, he added. I set the plate down. Took a breath. You shouldn't be here, I said. He didn't move closer. It's just a dinner. Not for me. I haven't said anything, he said, voice low, almost apologetic. I won't. I didn't ask for that. No, he said. But I thought you needed to know. I turned then, slowly. The room was dim, lit only by the light above the stove. His face was mostly shadow, but I could still read his expression, calm, steady, watching. "This isn't a game," I whispered. "I know. You don't understand what you're playing with." "I'm not playing." The silence between us stretched long and thin. I felt my chest tighten. I wanted to scream at him. I wanted to beg him to leave. But most of all, I wanted to understand why a single moment, one mistake, had managed to haunt me so completely. He reached into his pocket and pulled something out, a small folded note. "For you," he said. I didn't take it. He placed it gently on the counter beside me. "I'll go," he said. "But don't pretend it didn't happen." And then he left. Just like that. I stood there for several minutes, the note untouched, the sounds of laughter and conversation drifting in from the other room. Eventually, I picked it up, unfolded it. "You looked happy." That's all I wanted to say. There was no signature. No pressure. Just that sentence. And it undid me more than anything else. Because he was right. I did look happy. In that video. In that moment. In a way I hadn't looked in years. I didn't sleep that night. I lay beside my husband, listening to the rhythm of his breath, wondering if he could feel the distance growing between us. I kept waiting for him to ask if something was wrong, but he didn't. And maybe that hurt even more. Over the next week, I found myself withdrawing. I spoke less. Smiled less. I avoided mirrors. Avoided music. Even my own reflection felt like a confrontation I wasn't ready for. My friend at work, someone I had known for over a decade, noticed. During a coffee break, she looked at me carefully, her brows furrowed. "You're somewhere else lately," she said. I offered a tight smile. "Just tired." "You're not," she replied, gently. "But okay." She didn't push. And I didn't offer. That night, I stood in front of my closet for almost half an hour, unsure of what to wear to bed. Everything felt wrong, too plain, too revealing, too familiar. I finally chose an old cotton shirt, one I hadn't worn in years, and stared at myself in it for a long time. There was nothing special about it. But I remembered the way my husband used to look at me when I wore it. I remembered the way I used to feel. Wanted. I walked into the bedroom. He was already under the covers, reading. "You're late," he said, smiling faintly. I climbed in beside him. Lay still. Watched the ceiling. "I miss you," I said suddenly, the words catching in my throat. He looked over, surprised. "I'm right here." I nodded but didn't reply. Because that was the problem. He was here. And yet, I'd never felt more alone. The following Monday came with a gray sky and heavy rain, as if the world itself had decided to press pause. I stood by the kitchen window with a lukewarm cup of coffee in my hands, watching the rivulets race down the glass, blurring everything on the other side. My husband had already left for work. The house was quiet, filled only with the steady rhythm of the storm. I should have felt relief, a day off, a quiet house, no obligations, but instead, I felt restless. My thoughts, like the water on the window, were slipping, reforming, never staying still. I couldn't stop thinking about the note, the message, the dinner. Him. I didn't want to, but that didn't matter anymore. The thoughts came uninvited. I moved through the house trying to shake it off. I wiped counters that didn't need cleaning, rearranged bookshelves that hadn't changed in years, stood in front of the mirror longer than necessary, examining my face for something I could no longer define: age, maybe. Or absence. Or both. In the early afternoon, I received a text from my husband, *, don't forget, you promised to check in on David's son about the presentation. He's at the library most afternoons, asterisk. I stared at the message for a long time, feeling the weight of it settle in my chest. I had forgotten. Or maybe I had subconsciously chosen to forget. Either way, there it was, a small, harmless obligation that suddenly felt anything but harmless. I replied simply, I'll go. The library was only a 15-minute drive, but it felt like crossing a border. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, leaving the streets wet and reflective. I parked, sat in the car for a moment, watching people come and go. Students with backpacks. Mothers with strollers. No one noticing me. Inside, the library was quiet in a way that always made me feel both comforted and exposed. I walked slowly between the shelves, scanning tables, pretending to browse. Then I saw him. He was seated alone at a table near the window, a laptop open in front of him, papers spread out in deliberate disarray. He didn't see me right away. I considered turning around, walking out, pretending I hadn't found him. But then he looked up, and it was too late. Our eyes met, and something subtle passed between us, a recognition, tension, memory. He offered a small, surprised smile, then stood as I approached. I didn't expect you, he said, keeping his voice low. I nodded, placing my bag on the chair beside me. Neither did I. He motioned to the seat across from him, and I sat, not quite looking at him, focusing instead on the papers. You're working on the script? I asked. Trying, he replied. It's changed a lot since. He trailed off, and the silence between us grew thick. I folded my hands on the table. I'm not here to talk about that. I know. I just came to check in. That's all. He nodded, but I could feel his eyes on me, studying me. You don't have to stay, he said after a moment. But I did. I stayed. We sat there in silence for a while, the air between us still charged with what we weren't saying. I watched the rain through the window, listened to the quiet hum of distant whispers and the occasional rustle of turning pages. Finally, he leaned forward slightly. Can I ask you something? I didn't answer right away. I wasn't sure I wanted to know what he would ask. Do you regret it? He said softly. That moment? I met his eyes then, and the question hung in the space between us like smoke. I regret what it means, I said carefully. Not just the moment, but everything around it. He looked down, his fingers tracing the edge of his notebook. I wasn't trying to cause damage, he said. I wanted to feel something real. And I think you did too. I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping the floor just loud enough to make nearby students glance over. I gathered my bag and steadied my breath. We shouldn't be having this conversation, I said. I know. I don't want any more messages. No more notes. No more anything. He didn't argue. He didn't apologize. He just looked at me with something like understanding. Or maybe resignation. I walked out without saying goodbye. Back in the car, I gripped the steering wheel tightly, grounding myself in the solidity of it. My heart was pounding, not from fear, but from the effort it took to hold the line. To say no when part of me still wanted a yes. Not to him, necessarily. But to whatever it was I had felt in that moment. To the version of myself I had caught a glimpse of. The one who smiled without hesitation. The one who felt seen. When I returned home, the house was still quiet. I went to the bedroom, changed into my scrubs, and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I just sat, letting the silence stretch. That evening, my husband came home with flowers. Not for any reason. Just because. He placed them in a vase, kissed me on the cheek, and asked how my day had been. I lied. Told him it was quiet. Told him I had spent it reading, catching up on rest. Later, as I folded laundry in the living room, I found one of his old shirts buried at the bottom of the basket. A shirt I had always loved on him, years ago. I held it for a moment, pressing it to my face. It smelled like detergent and something faintly familiar, something from when we were younger. I placed it carefully in his drawer, then returned to folding. Each motion slow. Precise. Deliberate. That night, as we lay in bed, I turned toward him and placed my hand gently on his chest. He looked at me, slightly surprised, and I saw the questions in his eyes. But he didn't ask them. And I didn't explain. We fell asleep like that, not holding each other, but close enough to remember how it once felt. Close enough, maybe, to start again. The next few days unfolded like a delicate balancing act. I tried to fall back into routine, to rebuild the sense of normalcy I had carefully preserved over the years. I woke up early, made breakfast, commuted to work, greeted patients with the same professional warmth I'd always relied on. On the surface, everything moved as it should, the world remained predictable, stable, even kind in its familiarity. But underneath, I felt the shift. Something fragile had cracked, and I could hear the echo of it every time I paused long enough to breathe. I didn't hear from him again. Not a message, not a note, not a glance, nothing. And in some ways, that made it harder. I kept waiting, anticipating, imagining how I'd respond if he did reach out. But the silence wasn't peaceful, it was loaded. It felt like a thread left hanging, a door not quite shut. And the longer it stretched, the more my thoughts returned to that moment, that kiss, and the version of myself I didn't recognize and couldn't ignore. One evening, after a long shift, I came home to find my husband working on something in the garage. He didn't hear me enter. I stood for a few moments at the doorway, watching him. He was bent over a small workbench, fixing something with steady hands, the same hands that had built our first crib, that had held mine through long nights with sick children, that still reached for me absent-mindedly in sleep. I felt a strange mix of affection and distance, a tender kind of guilt that made my throat tighten. He looked up and smiled when he saw me. "You're home early," he said. "Not really," I replied. "Just didn't stop for groceries this time." He nodded, wiped his hands on an old towel, and followed me inside. I made tea while he read the paper. We talked about the weather, the neighbors, the usual. And yet, beneath every word was the sound of something unsaid, a tension I couldn't name, but couldn't silence either. That night, I lay awake again. The house was quiet, the kind of stillness that only comes deep into the night, when even the pipes seem to hold their breath. I turned toward him, watching the lines of his face in the moonlight. He looked peaceful. Content. And I felt like a stranger lying beside someone who had once known me completely. I slipped out of bed and walked quietly to the living room, wrapping myself in a blanket. I didn't turn on the lights. I sat in the dark, the silence around me a kind of mirror. My mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. Was I unhappy? Or just restless? Had I wanted something more, or simply something different? And if I didn't know the answer, how could I possibly make peace with what I had done? The next morning, I went through the motions again, but this time I couldn't hide the weight I carried. My friend at work noticed it first. "You look pale," she said gently during lunch. "Are you all right?" "I'm just tired," I said, the lie practiced now. She didn't press. But her eyes lingered on mine a little longer than usual. That afternoon, I opened the email he had sent weeks ago, the one with the video link. I hadn't clicked it again since that first night, but it sat there, unopened, as if daring me to revisit what I'd tried so hard to bury. I hovered over it for a moment, then closed the window. I knew it wouldn't help. Watching it again wouldn't erase the feeling it had stirred. It wouldn't make the guilt disappear. It wouldn't make the silence mean less. Later that week, my husband suggested we spend Saturday out of town, just the two of us. A day trip, nothing extravagant. I agreed too quickly. I needed the escape, and maybe, just maybe, a chance to find our way back to something real. We left early in the morning, drove for hours through quiet roads lined with trees turning gold with early autumn. We stopped at a small lake and walked along the shore. We talked more than we had in weeks, about simple things, old memories, places we'd never been, food we wanted to try. For a while, it felt like it used to. Easy. Warm. But there were still pauses. Gaps where I should have said more, admitted more. I watched him skip a stone across the water and thought about how much he still didn't know. How much I had kept hidden not just from him, but from myself. On the way back, we stopped for coffee at a roadside diner. He went to the counter while I waited at the booth. I looked out the window, and for a moment, I saw a reflection I didn't recognize. I had changed. Not in some dramatic, visible way, but in the way I held myself. The way I looked around a room. The way I carried silence. And then the door to the diner opened, and for a moment, no more than a second, I thought I saw him. Not my husband. The other him. The mistake. The moment. But it wasn't him. Just someone with the same build, same walk. Still, it was enough to pull me sharply back into everything I had been trying to forget. That night, back at home, I unpacked in silence. My husband turned on the television and called me into the living room. I hesitated. "I'll be there in a minute," I said. But I didn't go. I stood in the hallway, staring at the closed door of our bedroom. I wanted to feel at peace. I wanted to believe that day had brought us closer. And maybe it had. But I also knew that no trip, no moment of laughter, no carefully planned distraction could undo what had already been done. We had kissed. That truth, however brief and buried, lived in the space between then and now. And no matter how far I drove, no matter how carefully I walked the line, it was still there, waiting. The next morning, I woke up before the alarm. The light filtering through the blinds was dim, soft, gray, the kind of light that made the world feel distant, like it hadn't fully decided to wake up. I lay there for a few minutes, eyes open, my thoughts already moving faster than I wanted them to. My husband was still asleep beside me, his back turned, his breathing steady. I watched the slow rise and fall of his shoulders and wondered if he was dreaming. And if so, of what? Or who? I made coffee and sat alone in the kitchen, the mug warming my hands, offering no real comfort. I scrolled through emails, checked the weather, opened a few messages from work, but my mind was somewhere else entirely. It wasn't just about the moment anymore. It was about everything that came after. The silence. The pretending. The shift in how I viewed my life, my choices, my marriage. Myself. A week had passed since our day trip, and although my husband had been more attentive, sending little texts, making more eye contact, asking questions he hadn't asked in years, something inside me felt heavier, not lighter. I appreciated his effort. I saw it. But it didn't reach the part of me that had changed. Not yet. Maybe not ever. That afternoon, while sorting mail in the hallway, I found a small envelope tucked between utility bills. No return address, just my name written neatly in blue ink. I felt my heart knock against my ribs as I turned it over. I hesitated for a long time before opening it. Inside was a single photo. A still frame, printed on glossy paper. It showed the moment, the two of us in the escape room, the kiss captured from the perfect angle. I stared at it, my breath caught somewhere between shock and disbelief. There was no note. No context. No threat. Just the image. As if someone was saying, asterisk, this happened. Don't forget, asterisk. I didn't know what to do. There were no instructions. No demands. No explanation. I checked the envelope again. Nothing. I turned the photo over. Blank. I stood there for several minutes, the hallway stretching out around me, the quiet pressing in. And then I folded the photo and put it in the drawer with the flash drive, as if keeping them together might make the chaos feel contained. I didn't tell anyone. Not my husband. Not my friend. Not even myself, not out loud. Later that day, I found myself walking aimlessly through a local bookstore. I wandered between shelves, fingers brushing over titles I didn't recognize, pulling one out at random, pretending to be interested. I needed to be somewhere unfamiliar. Somewhere I didn't have to perform. As I reached for a book on the top shelf, someone brushed past me. I turned. It was him. He didn't speak right away. Just looked at me with that same unreadable calm. I didn't send it, he said quietly. I didn't say you did. He paused, searching my face. But you think I did? I didn't answer. I looked down at the floor, then back at him. Did you? No. Then who did? I don't know. The silence between us thickened. People moved around us as browsing, talking, laughing, completely unaware of the tension stretching like wire between our bodies. I didn't keep the video, he said finally. I filmed it, yes. But I didn't share it. Not with anyone. I wanted to believe him. But belief had become a shifting thing, no longer solid under my feet. Why are you telling me this now? Because I thought you should know. And what am I supposed to do with that? He didn't answer. And I didn't wait for one. I walked away, book still in hand, not caring what it was. I paid for it without remembering the title and drove home with the windows down, the cold air biting at my skin like I deserved it. That night, I sat in bed, the unopened book on my lap, the photo still folded in my pocket. My husband came in, looked at me with mild concern. You okay? He asked. I nodded. He got into bed beside me, turned off the light, and we lay there in darkness. Not touching. Not speaking. Just existing side by side. The next morning, I dropped the photo into the shredder at work. Watched it disappear, strip by strip. It felt like closure, but only for a second. Because the memory remained. Not just in my head, but in the way I carried myself now. In the space between me and the people I loved. In the questions I couldn't answer. Later, at lunch, my friend cornered me in the break room. She waited until we were alone before she spoke. You're unraveling, she said, not unkindly. I'm tired, I offered again, the same tired phrase. She shook her head. No. You're hiding something. And it's eating you alive. I didn't deny it. I just looked away. I don't need to know what it is, she said. But whatever it is, you either need to bury it completely, or bring it into the light. Because right now, it's somewhere in between, and that's the worst place to live. Her words stayed with me for the rest of the day. That night, I couldn't sleep. I got up, stood by the kitchen window, watched the trees bend in the wind. The photo was gone. The flash drive still hidden. The truth still unspoken. But the weight of it all was growing. Something would have to break. And soon. The weight of the photo lingered, even after it had been shredded. Even after I'd emptied the bin myself and taken the trash outside, as if personally removing the pieces might also remove the shame. But the image wasn't on paper anymore, it had rooted itself somewhere deeper. It followed me like a shadow, not always visible, but impossible to forget. I noticed it in the way I moved through our home. More quietly. More carefully. As if stepping too loudly might call attention to the silence I carried. I felt it in the distance between me and my husband, how we still shared space, still exchanged small gestures of affection, but never really touched what mattered. Each day bled into the next. I kept my head down at work, avoided long conversations, skipped lunch with coworkers. I filled every spare moment with tasks, laundry, meal prep, late-night filing. Anything that would keep my hands busy and my thoughts at bay. But avoidance has its limits. One evening, my husband came home earlier than expected. I was in the middle of sorting old paperwork in the guest room, folders spread out like a chaotic map of our shared life, when he stood in the doorway and watched me. "You've been quiet lately," he said. His tone wasn't accusatory. Just observant. I glanced up, heart skipping for a moment, unsure how much he saw. "Just cleaning." He stepped into the room, looked down at the open folders, the photos from past vacations, birthday cards, receipts for long-forgotten repairs. All of this suddenly urgent? I forced a small smile. I guess I needed a project. He didn't push. Just stood there for another second too long, then nodded and walked out. But something about the way he lingered stayed with me. I could feel a shift. A question forming on the edge of his silence. That night, I couldn't sleep. Again. The house felt unusually still. Even the wind outside had quieted, as though holding its breath with me. I stood in the dark living room, the glow from a single street lamp slicing across the floor. I walked to the drawer and opened it slowly. The flash drive was still there, untouched. I hadn't been able to destroy it, even after all this time. It was like a splinter I couldn't dig out, too small, buried, but always aching. I turned it over in my hand, pressed my thumb against the cold plastic. My pulse thudded in my neck. And then I heard it, soft footsteps behind me. I turned. My husband stood at the end of the hallway, partially lit by the same fractured beam of light. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded too quickly. "Couldn't sleep." He looked at the flash drive in my hand. His eyes narrowed just slightly, not in suspicion, but in recognition. He remembered. He had seen it before. On the hallway table. The night I said it was just a video from the shoot. "What's that?" he asked. My mouth was dry. I looked down at the flash drive, then back at him. I felt the truth gathering at the edge of my tongue, pounding like a drumbeat behind my ribs. I opened my mouth, then closed it. "Just something from the clinic," I said. He didn't argue. He didn't accuse. He simply nodded and turned away. And that was somehow worse. The next day, I couldn't concentrate at work. I made mistakes, forgot a dosage, misfiled a chart, spilled coffee on a patient's intake form. My supervisor pulled me aside gently, asking if everything was okay. I lied again. Said it was just fatigue. She looked skeptical, but let it go. After work, I didn't go straight home. I drove around aimlessly for nearly an hour, winding through neighborhoods I didn't recognize, watching strangers walk their dogs, children ride their bikes, couples laugh over shared ice cream. I envied their simplicity, the illusion of peace. Eventually, I pulled into a small lot near a wooded trail. I walked without direction, gravel crunching beneath my shoes, the quietness of the trees pressing in. I sat on the bench that faced nothing in particular and let myself feel the full weight of everything I'd tried to bury. I had wanted it to disappear. The kiss. The moment. The aftermath. I thought that if I could just be quiet enough, careful enough, distant enough, it would dissolve. That the version of me who let it happen would fade. But she hadn't. She was still here. Still restless. Still aching. When I returned home, the house was empty. My husband had left a note on the fridge, something about running errands, picking up dinner. I read it 3 times before placing it back exactly where I found it. I went to our bedroom, sat on the edge of the bed, and took off my shoes slowly, deliberately. Then I walked to the closet and reached for a sweater I hadn't worn in years. It still smelled faintly of lavender, of autumn, of a time when things felt simpler. I pulled it over my head and looked at myself in the mirror. I looked older. Tired. But also clearer. Something had to give. That evening, he returned carrying a paper bag and 2 containers of soup. We ate in silence at the table, the clink of spoons against porcelain the only sound between us. Afterward, I cleared the dishes. He dried them. We moved like 2 people who knew each other's rhythms by heart, even as our hearts moved further apart. As I reached for a towel, his hand brushed mine. I froze. So did he. For a moment, neither of us moved. He looked at me. Really looked. I feel like you're somewhere else, he said quietly. I stood there, the weight of his words like a stone in my chest. I'm here, I said. But even I could hear the lie in my voice. He didn't press. Just nodded and left the room. Later that night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. The air between us was thick with everything unsaid. I could feel him beside me, warm, present, familiar, and yet so far. And as I closed my eyes, one sentence repeated itself over and over, quiet as breath. We spent the night together. It had happened. And it couldn't be undone. But what I chose to do next, whether I buried it or faced it, would determine everything else. The silence in the house had shifted. It no longer felt like the gentle quiet of routine or rest, but something heavier, almost brittle. Every conversation between us was clipped, efficient, missing the familiar warmth that used to linger even in mundane exchanges. I felt it in the way he closed doors just a little harder, in the way he didn't wait for my goodnight anymore. Nothing explosive. Just subtle changes, as if something unspoken had begun to calcify between us. At work, I found myself zoning out more often, making careless mistakes I normally wouldn't. I misread a dosage, forgot to reorder a supply, left a patient chart unfinished. My supervisor called me into her office, not angrily, just concerned, and asked if I was okay. I told her I was just tired. It was the easiest lie to reach for. I didn't mention the email. It had arrived the night before. No subject line. No sender name. Just an attachment with the same title as before, scene 3_final.mp4. I hadn't opened it. I didn't need to. I already knew what it contained. But the timing made it worse. It felt deliberate, as if someone were watching, waiting for the moment when I was most uncertain. Most fragile. I deleted the email without downloading the file. Then I emptied the trash. Then I turned off the computer and sat in the dark, wondering who else might still have access to it. Wondering if this would ever end. I considered telling him, the young man at the center of this mess. But what would that accomplish? If he was behind it, he'd deny it. If he wasn't, what comfort could he offer? I didn't need more questions. I needed this to stop. And I knew, finally, that it wouldn't. Not unless I made it. That weekend, my husband planned to visit his sister in a nearby town. He invited me to join him, but I declined. I said I had to catch up on work. Another lie, but not one he pushed back on. He nodded, kissed my cheek, and left with an overnight bag. The moment the door closed behind him, the house felt different, empty, yes, but also honest. I wasn't pretending anymore. I stood in the center of the living room, still holding my coffee cup, and knew what I had to do. I pulled out a notebook and began to write. I didn't write everything, not all the details, not the moments I'd already replayed too many times. But I wrote the truth. I wrote about the kiss, the confusion, the silence afterward. I wrote about the flash drive and the photo and the note and the second email. I wrote about the guilt, the disorientation, the slow erosion of the life I had once thought unshakable. I wrote until my hand cramped, until the sun had started to shift across the floor, until I no longer recognized my own handwriting. And then I read it. From beginning to end. It wasn't a confession. It was a clearing. I ripped out the pages and folded them into a single envelope. I didn't address it. I didn't know if I'd ever actually give it to him, my husband, or if it was just a gesture for myself. But it felt necessary. Like building an exit even if I hadn't yet decided to walk through it. That night, I sat in the backyard wrapped in an old quilt, watching the moon rise. The air was cool and dry, the kind that signaled summer had fully turned. I listened to the rustling leaves, the far-off sound of a train, the soft creak of the wooden fence shifting in the wind. And I thought about how small choices become turning points. How moments you don't intend can grow roots and shape everything after. I didn't regret the feeling. That was the hardest part to admit. The attention. The intimacy. The brief and blinding sense of being visible again. But I regretted the cost. The ache. The distance I had created in a home that once felt like sanctuary. When my husband returned the next day, he seemed more relaxed than he had in weeks. He brought me a jar of local honey from his sister's farmer's market, held it out with a smile I hadn't seen in a while. "I thought of you when I saw it," he said. I took it, thanked him, placed it on the counter. The kindness in his voice made something catch in my chest. Later that night, while folding laundry, I found an old sweatshirt of his tucked between towels. It still smelled faintly of him, of aftershave, of weekend mornings. I held it to my face longer than I meant to. And then I placed it carefully in his drawer, wondering if he would notice. Before bed, he asked if I wanted to watch something together. I said yes. We sat on the couch, side by side, a blanket over our laps, the flicker of the screen the only light in the room. I don't remember the plot of the show. I just remember the warmth of his arm beside mine. The way he laughed. The way, halfway through, he glanced at me like he used to. We didn't talk about anything deeper. Not that night. Not yet. But something had shifted again. A different kind of silence. One that didn't feel like avoidance, but readiness. And I realized then that the real decision wasn't about telling him or not telling him. It was about who I wanted to be on the other side of this. What kind of truth I was willing to live with. And whether I still believed that rebuilding was possible, not the life we had, but the one we might still make. I woke early the next morning, hours before the sun began to rise, and lay in the dimness of our bedroom staring at the ceiling. My husband was still asleep beside me, his breathing slow and even. I could hear the faint creak of tree branches outside, the occasional shift of the house as it settled deeper into the early morning silence. But inside me, there was no peace, only a growing, insistent pressure that could no longer be ignored. I had spent weeks hoping the truth might dissolve if I kept quiet long enough, that it would shrink into the corners of my mind and eventually disappear. But it hadn't. It had grown heavier with each passing day, a weight I carried through every moment, every interaction, every half-smile that passed between us. It was exhausting. And I couldn't carry it any longer. The envelope still sat in the drawer by my bedside, folded and yellowed slightly at the edges from where I had handled it too many times. It wasn't long, just a few pages, handwritten, uneven in tone, but it held everything I needed to say. I had revised it a dozen times and considered burning it even more. But I had kept it, and that meant something. I slipped out of bed without waking him and went into the kitchen. The morning light had just begun to show along the edge of the horizon, casting a faint blue hue across the countertops. I made tea, though I didn't want it, and stood staring out the window as steam curled from the mug. After a few minutes, I walked back into the bedroom. He was beginning to stir, his arm reaching across the bed as if searching for me. When his eyes opened, they found mine almost immediately. "Hey," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "You're up early." "I couldn't sleep," I replied quietly. He sat up slowly, blinking against the soft light that had begun to fill the room. I stood near the door, my hands clenched at my sides, heart pounding. "I need to talk to you," I said. Those 5 words changed the shape of the room. His posture straightened. The ease in his expression dissolved into something more guarded. He nodded once and swung his legs over the side of the bed. "Okay," he said. "Here?" I shook my head. "Let's sit in the living room." We walked together down the hallway, not speaking. I carried the envelope in one hand, folding it over and over between my fingers as if trying to rub the guilt out of it. The couch felt colder than usual when I sat down. I waited until he was settled across from me before speaking. "I want you to listen. All the way through. Please. And then, if you want to ask me anything, I'll answer." He nodded again, slower this time. Cautious. I placed the envelope between us on the coffee table. I wrote it down because I didn't think I could say it all out loud. Not the right way. But I'll try. I took a breath. And then another. "It started a couple months ago," I began, my voice steady but thin. "I went to help with a film project. You remember? The escape room." He nodded once, almost imperceptibly. "It was supposed to be harmless. I didn't expect anything. I didn't plan anything. It just happened." I told him everything. I told him about the kiss. About how it caught me off guard. About how I didn't stop it, and how I hadn't been able to forget it. I told him about the flash drive, the video, the moment I saw myself on the screen and didn't recognize the woman there. I told him about the photo, the messages, the silence. About how I had felt invisible for so long, and how that moment, however fleeting, made me feel seen. I didn't cry. I thought I might, but the words came too carefully for tears. I was trying to be exact. Honest. I didn't want to dramatize or excuse anything. I just wanted him to know the truth. When I finished, the room fell into a silence so deep I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. He sat with his hands clasped between his knees, staring at the floor. His jaw was tight. His brow furrowed. I couldn't read his expression. I didn't try. "I know what I've done," I said finally. "And I know it changes things. I just didn't want to keep lying to you." He looked up then. His eyes weren't angry. Just tired. And something else, something like heartbreak. "Why now?" he asked. His voice was low. "Because I can't carry it anymore," I said. "And because I don't want to build anything new between us on something false." He didn't respond right away. He leaned back, ran a hand through his hair, exhaled slowly. I could see him trying to process it all, trying to find words that matched what he was feeling. "I need some time," he said at last. "I understand." He stood up, walked over to the window, and stood with his back to me. The silence between us stretched long and flat, and I let it. I didn't try to fill it. I had said everything I came to say. After a few minutes, he turned back to me. "I'm not sure what this means yet," he said. "I'm not sure what I feel. I need to sit with it." "Of course," I said. He walked down the hallway and closed the door to the bedroom. I remained on the couch, my hands folded in my lap, the envelope still on the table like an offering. I didn't feel relief. I didn't feel lighter. But I felt something new, something sharp and real and unfiltered. And that, at least, was honest. Later, I went for a walk, not caring where I ended up. I moved slowly through the streets of our neighborhood, the early sunlight softening the edges of everything. I passed houses with open windows and dogs barking in backyards. I passed children drawing chalk figures on sidewalks. Life continued, as it always had, indifferent to the quiet upheaval of mine. When I returned home, the bedroom door was still closed. I didn't knock. I sat at the kitchen table, opened my notebook, and began to write again. Not for explanation this time. Not for confession. Just to hear my own voice again. Clear. Honest. And finally, unafraid. The next morning, I woke to an unfamiliar quiet. The kind that comes not from peace but from distance. The kind that fills a space when something important has been said and nothing has yet taken its place. I lay in bed for a while, unsure if I should get up, unsure what the day would hold. The house felt foreign, like someone else's belongings filled the drawers, someone else's routines belonged to the halls. Eventually, I went into the kitchen. The coffee pot was already brewing, which meant he was up. But he wasn't there. The cups remained untouched in the cabinet. The refrigerator was closed. The chairs were all still pushed in. I looked toward the back door and noticed it was open slightly, letting in a sliver of morning light. I followed the sound of his footsteps on the deck. He stood outside, facing the backyard, arms resting on the wooden railing. He didn't look over when I stepped out. I didn't say anything at first. Just joined him in the silence. The garden looked overgrown, unruly after a week of neglect. The rosemary bush had spilled past its planter, the small tomatoes on the vine splitting from too much rain. For a moment, that felt like a metaphor too easy to ignore. Finally, he spoke. "I've been thinking." I nodded, even though he couldn't see it. "About how many things I've taken for granted," he continued. "And how many things I've missed. In you. In us." I stayed quiet. The wind stirred a few dry leaves across the porch. A bird chirped once and then went silent again. "I'm not angry," he said. That caught me off guard. I looked at him then, trying to read the meaning beneath his words. "I was," he added after a pause. "Last night. And maybe part of me still is. But mostly, I'm just sad." That, more than anything else, broke something in me. Not the anger. Not the betrayal. But the sadness. The quiet recognition of what had been lost, not in one moment, but slowly, over time, like a thread pulled unnoticed until the whole thing unraveled. "I am too," I said. He turned toward me, his eyes tired but kind. "I keep wondering what I did to make you feel so far away." I opened my mouth to answer, then closed it again. There was no single sentence that could explain it. No neat cause and effect. Only layers of absence. Years of routine. Moments where I needed something and didn't say it. Moments where he asked and I deflected. We had both stopped reaching, and neither of us noticed until it was too late. "It wasn't about wanting someone else," I said finally. "It was about remembering what it felt like to be wanted." He looked down at his hands, folded over the railing. "That's hard to hear. But I think I needed to." We stood there a long time after that. No further confessions. No promises. Just the shared acknowledgement of damage done. Later, over breakfast, we talked about what came next, not in concrete terms, not in ultimatums, but in ideas. We agreed to try therapy. Not because we believed it would fix everything, but because we wanted to understand what had broken. We agreed to be honest, even when it was uncomfortable. Especially then. I asked him if he wanted to read the letter. The one I had written weeks ago and kept folded in the drawer. He shook his head gently. You already told me what mattered. That's enough. In the following days, the atmosphere in the house changed. It wasn't tense, exactly, but cautious. We spoke more deliberately. We made time for meals together. We asked more questions. Not about what had happened, but about what we each needed now. He didn't bring up the name. He didn't ask for details I hadn't offered. Whether out of restraint or pain, I didn't know. I only knew that he had chosen not to weaponize the truth, and for that I was grateful. I cleared the drawer where the flash drive had lived for so long. I placed it into a small tin box, locked it, and took it to the recycling center on a weekday afternoon when no one was home. I watched it disappear into the pile of broken electronics and felt something loosen in my chest. I didn't hear from the young man again. No more emails. No more notes. Just silence. Whether it was out of guilt, respect, or indifference, I'll never know. And I stopped trying to decipher it. Instead, I turned my attention inward. I went back to journaling, not for confession now, but reflection. I walked more. I started reading again. Not romance, not drama, but quiet novels about small lives, ordinary people trying to repair what mattered. One Sunday morning, weeks later, my husband and I found ourselves in the kitchen at the same time. I was slicing apples. He was boiling water for tea. Our movements synchronized without discussion. At one point, our hands brushed, and we both paused. Not startled. Not awkward. Just aware. He smiled, the smallest shift at the corners of his mouth. And I smiled back. It wasn't forgiveness. Not entirely. But it was presence. It was a beginning. I don't know where we go from here. I don't know what version of us will end up becoming. But I know now that honesty matters more than comfort. That silence may feel safe, but it corrodes slowly. And that wanting to be seen is not a flaw, but a need that deserves to be named. This is the truth. And sometimes, naming it is the bravest thing you can do.